May 4th, 1987, 8:30 a.m., London, Kensington. Behind the thick brick walls of Garden Lodge Mansion, which Freddie Mercury had turned into his impregnable fortress, reigned that specific cotton-like silence that usually precedes a catastrophe, but on this particular morning, the silence was deceptive, like the calm before a tsunami. You are used to seeing Freddie on stage, in a crown and ermine mantle, commanding thousands of people with a single movement of his pinky finger. But if you had been in his bedroom at that second, you would not have seen a king, but a man whose body had already begun to betray him, covered in the first signs of a deadly disease, still hidden from the public. However, on this overcast morning, the pain piercing his chest had nothing to do with the virus devouring his immunity. This pain was sharper than a scalpel and colder than a gravestone, because its source was not a physical ailment, but a fresh issue of the Sun newspaper, just brought in by the staff along with cooling tea. Imagine this moment. Freddie, still half asleep, reaches for the glossy paper, expecting to see the usual gossip or reviews, but instead, his gaze crashes into a headline that burns the air in the room. AIDS kills Freddie's two lovers. You think this is just another tabloid hoax? In the 80s, tabloids wrote all sorts of things about him every day. But when Freddie began to read the text, his hands, the very hands that wrote Bohemian Rhapsody, began to shake so violently that the newspaper rustled like dry leaves in the wind. There were not just lies there. There was the truth, the monstrous, intimate, naked truth that only two people on the entire planet knew. The article described everything: the names of the medicines he took in secret, his nightmares that made him wake up in a cold sweat, the names of his former partners who had indeed died of the 20th century plague, and worst of all, it quoted his personal fears, which he whispered only in the dark, his face buried in a pillow. Who could have done this? Who could know the details of how he cries when he thinks no one is looking? It couldn't be a random waiter or an aggrieved fan. This was a sniper shot to the back, taken from arm's length. And here your brain tries to find an excuse. You think, maybe a wiretap? Maybe a stolen diary? But reality takes that very Santa Barbara style turn that makes you sick. Freddie knew this handwriting. He knew these phrases. It was the man who had stood behind his right shoulder for years, shooing away photographers. The man who managed his schedule, his connections, and his life. Paul Prenter. That same Paul who swore eternal loyalty. That same Paul who convinced Freddie to break ties with Queen during the Munich period, claiming that only he, Paul, truly loved Freddie. In that second, Freddie Mercury's world didn't just collapse. It shrank to the size of a small newspaper column. The realization was a physical blow to the gut. The person with whom he shared his bed, his secrets, and his soul had methodically, coldly, and calculatedly sold him to his worst enemies, Rupert Murdoch's tabloids. You ask yourself, for how much? What is the price of a legend's soul? $1 million? Half a fortune? No. The cheapness of this deal oozed through the fine print. Prenter sold his king for just £32,000. That was the price for which he gutted a dying man's personal life for the crowd's amusement. But in this whirlpool of horror and betrayal, there is one detail, one dagger, which you must notice right now to understand the depth of the tragedy. Recall Paul Prenter's wrist. In all the photos of that time where he stands next to Freddie, gold glitters on his hand. It was a Cartier watch, not just a watch, but a Christmas gift. From Freddie, a symbol of their closeness, a symbol of the boundless generosity of Mercury, who showered his loved ones with diamonds. Freddie remembered that watch. He imagined Paul sitting in the Sun editor's office, haggling over the fee, laying out the dirtiest details of his former boss's illness on the table, and how that gold watch, a gift from Freddie himself, ticked on his hand, counting down the seconds until the print run. Tick, tock. 30 pieces of silver in modern equivalent. Tick, tock. Every second of that time was paid for by Freddie's love, and now that love was converted into newspaper poison. Do you think Freddie screamed? Do you think he smashed a vase or threw the phone against the wall? No. An absolute ringing silence hung in the room. It was the silence of a man who realized that his fortress had fallen not because of a siege from the outside, but because the fortress commandant opened the gates to the enemy while the king slept. He looked at the newspaper, and the ink on the paper seemed to him like mud with which he had been smeared from head to toe. He was naked before millions of readers. His right to privacy, his right to be ill and die with dignity, had been stolen and sold for the price of a used car. In that moment, on May 4th, 1987, Freddie Mercury died for the first time. Not physically, but emotionally. The Freddie who believed that love and loyalty could be bought with generosity ceased to exist. In his place was born a man who had to make the cruelest decision of his life, to cut out the tumor that bore the name Paul Prenter, even if this operation cost him the remnants of his heart. But he didn't yet know that this article was just the beginning, and that Prenter had prepared even more terrible revelations for him that would finish off his reputation completely. Who is this Paul Prenter, whose name Queen fans pronounce with the same sacred horror and disgust with which historians speak of Judas Iscariot? You look at old photos where he stands behind Freddie's shoulder, tall, mustachioed, in a leather jacket, always half a step behind, like a shadow, and wonder, how could this man, a former radio DJ from Belfast with no special talents, subjugate the will of the greatest frontman on the planet? Roger Taylor, the band's drummer, who usually didn't mince words, called him the devil in the flesh, and this wasn't a metaphor, it was a diagnosis. But to understand the anatomy of this betrayal, you must discard the idea that Freddie was a naive victim. Everything was much more complex and terrifying. For Mercury, Prenter was not just a manager. He was the most dangerous drug of all that Freddie had ever tried, because Paul gave him what neither money nor fame could give. He gave him permission to be bad. Imagine the mechanism of this addiction. Freddie, torn between his strict Parsi upbringing and the wild, unbridled nature of his sexuality, was looking for a guide into this new, forbidden world, and Prenter gladly took his hand. He became the architect of isolation, methodically building an invisible but impenetrable wall around Freddie, the bricks of which were lies, flattery, and paranoia. Do you think Queen almost broke up in the early 80s due to creative differences or arguments about disco music? That is the lie we have been fed for years. The real reason sat in the management office and cut telephone wires. Prenter acted like a virus hijacking the central nervous system. When Brian May called to discuss recording, Paul would say with feigned concern, "Freddie isn't in the mood right now. He doesn't want to hear anyone." And then turn to Mercury and whisper, "See, they only call when they need something. They don't care how you feel." This divide and conquer tactic worked flawlessly because it hit Freddie's most painful point, his fear of loneliness. Prenter created an artificial vacuum in which he became the only source of oxygen, the only friend, the only one who truly understands, the genius, while the others supposedly just envied his success. Have you ever wondered why Mary Austin, the love of Freddie's life, was almost completely pushed out of his circle during the Munich period? It wasn't Freddie's decision. It was the work of Prenter, who understood, as long as there are people nearby who love Freddie the man, not Freddie the star, his power would not be absolute. He filtered letters. He didn't pass on messages. He physically barred old friends from the dressing room threshold, creating for Mercury the illusion that the whole world had turned its back on him, except for faithful Paul. Ask yourself honestly, looking in the mirror, how many times in your life have you trusted a person who smiled into your eyes, agreed with your darkest thoughts, and said exactly what you wanted to hear while sharpening a knife behind your back? We have all made this mistake, But we didn't have a multi-million-dollar empire that could be stolen. Freddie did. And Prenter played the long game, collecting compromising material, memorizing names, dates, doses, and weaknesses, turning every day of friendship into a page of a future indictment. He wasn't just a witness to the king's fall. He was the one pouring oil so the fire would burn brighter, because the weaker and more dependent Freddie became, the stronger Paul became. But here triggers that very Santa Barbara effect, which flips your understanding of the villain's motivation. You probably think Prenter sold Freddie solely for money, that he simply lacked funds for the luxurious life he was used to at the star's expense. It's logical, but it's too simple for such drama. The true reason for the betrayal was far more twisted and personal. It wasn't greed. It was the revenge of a rejected lover and a wounded ego. When Freddie began to see the light, when he, tired of the endless carnival of self-destruction, began to take the first tentative steps back to the band, to family, to sobriety, Prenter felt his power slipping away. Do you understand this psychological fracture? Paul Prenter could not allow Freddie to be happy without him. If he couldn't own the king, he decided to destroy the kingdom. Going to the Sun editorial office wasn't a way to earn £32,000, a laughable sum by industry standards. It was an act of public execution. He knew he wasn't hitting the wallet, but the reputation, the most sacred thing, Freddie's right to privacy. He didn't just sell photos. He sold the names of lovers who died of AIDS. He sold Freddie's night terrors, his tears, his moments of weakness. He told the world that the great Mercury, a symbol of strength and masculinity, was actually a frightened sick man who cried at night. It was a betrayal of biblical proportions because Prenter used intimacy as a weapon. He knew that Freddie feared pity and judgment more than anything in the world, and that is exactly what he ensured him. He turned the tragedy of illness into a dirty freak show, depriving Freddie of the opportunity to tell his story himself when the time came. The moment the printing press began stamping that circulation, Prenter ceased to be just a bad manager. He became a soul killer. And the scariest thing about this story is that Freddie didn't believe until the last second that Paul was capable of such a thing. He considered him a part of himself, his shadow, and a shadow cannot betray its master. But he forgot that at noon, when the sun is at its zenith, the shadow disappears, leaving you alone under the scorching rays of truth. That is exactly what happened that morning, when the newspaper landed on the silk sheets, dividing life into before and after, and starting a countdown for both participants in this drama, although one of them still thought he had won the jackpot. Freddie Mercury, slowly, as if his hands were made of fragile porcelain, lowered the newspaper to the edge of the bedside table, and at that moment, in the huge bedroom of Garden Lodge Mansion, that very visual silence we spoke of ensued, an absolute ringing vacuum in which one can hear not just breathing, but the very running of time slipping through fingers. You probably expect a storm to start now, that Freddie, known for his explosive temperament, will start smashing antique furniture, throwing priceless vases at the walls, or screaming so that the window panes rattle. After all, that's how people behave when their life collapses, right? But here happens what breaks all your ideas about victim psychology. Instead of a scream, only a quiet, dry exhale escaped his chest, like the rustle of falling leaves. He got out of bed, walked to the tall window, behind which the London sky wept with gray, endless rain, and pressed his forehead against the cold glass. Why is he calm? This question should be pulsing in your head. Has he resigned himself? Is he broken? The answer lies in a paradox available only to those who have looked death in the face. In that second, Freddie felt not rage, but a strange, chilling relief. For years he lived in fear that his secret would be revealed. For years he woke up in a cold sweat, thinking about what the press would say, what his parents would say, what the fans would say. This fear was a sword of Damocles hanging over his head by a hair held by Paul Prenter, And so the sword fell, the hair snapped. The worst had already happened. He stands naked before the whole world, and suddenly he realized there was nothing left to fear. The blackmailer ran out of bullets. Prenter fired his largest caliber, thinking he killed the king, but he only freed him from the need to hide. However, this calmness was deceptive. Under the icy crust of indifference, a volcano of a completely different nature began to boil. Not the hot rage of hysteria, but the cold, calculating determination of an executioner sharpening an axe. Freddie moved away from the window and headed toward the telephone that stood on a mahogany table. Every step on the soft carpet was heavy, as if he carried the weight of his own tombstone on his shoulders. He picked up the receiver, a dial tone, a long, monotonous sound, like the cardiogram of a dying man. His fingers, the very virtuoso fingers that had just trembled over the newspaper, now moved with surgical precision, dialing a number he knew by heart, a number that was once synonymous with salvation and had now become the access code to hell. On the other end of the line, in a cheap rented apartment or hotel room paid for by those very £32,000, the phone rang. Imagine Paul Prenter at this moment. What is he feeling? Triumph? Fear? Most likely he feels the thrill of a gambler who broke the bank. He is waiting for this call. He is sure he knows the script in advance. In his sick logic, distorted by envy and greed, Freddie will now beg. He will cry. He will offer double the price for Paul to publicly retract his words, or at least shut up and not release the second portion of filth. Prenter has already rehearsed his speech. He has already come up with the sum he will ask for silence. He thinks he holds Freddie by the throat, but he doesn't realize he is holding the corpse of their friendship by the throat, and you cannot negotiate with the dead. Prenter picks up the receiver after the third ring, a classic manipulator's move, making the victim suffer in anticipation. Hello? His voice sounds confident, even with a note of that fake care with which he poisoned Freddie for years. Maybe he even expected to hear the usual, "Darling, we need to talk." But in response, he hears only breathing, the heavy, measured breathing of a man standing on the edge of a precipice looking down. In this pause, stretching into eternity, the Santa Barbara effect occurs, flipping the balance of power. Prenter starts to get nervous. "Freddie, is that you?" His voice wavered. He expected hysteria, but the silence frightens him more. Silence is the unknown, and Freddie, at this time, looks at his hands. He remembers how these hands gave Paul the gold Cartier watch, the very one that is likely ticking on the trader's wrist right now, counting the seconds of his triumph. He remembers how Paul swore loyalty to him when Freddie lay with a fever of 40 degrees. All this lie flashes before his eyes like film thrown into a fire. And then Freddie utters words that were not written in any of Prenter's scripts. He speaks not loudly, not breaking into a scream, but with that frightening royal intonation that made stadiums freeze. "You will never hear my voice again," he says, and every word drops like a stone into water. "You thought you sold me, Paul? No. You sold yourself. You sold the only person who loved you, despite what a non-entity you are." On the other end of the line, Prenter tries to get a word in, tries to make excuses, maybe screams something about it being a mistake, that the journalist tricked him, or switches to threats, promising to tell even more. But Freddie interrupts him, not with a scream, but with a final sentence. "You are dead to me. Do not call here. Do not come here. If I see your shadow near my house, I will grind you into dust. Goodbye." Click. Freddie puts the receiver on the cradle. The connection is broken. Not just the telephone connection. The thread connecting him to the past is severed. Silence reigned in the room again, but now it was different. It was not the silence of fear, but the silence after a battle. Freddie stood, leaning his hand on the table, and felt something dying inside him. The part of his soul that was naive, that believed in unconditional loyalty, that sought love for money, was dying. Paul Prenter, without knowing it, did him a final service. He killed the victim in Freddie. But do you think it ended there? That Prenter just disappeared, dissolved into the London fog with a suitcase of money? You are mistaken. The plot takes a new turn. The moment Freddie hung up, he launched a mechanism of destruction, the power of which Prenter did not even suspect. Freddie didn't just break off the relationship, he gave an order. An hour later, the locks at Garden Lodge were changed. 2 hours later, Queen's lawyers began work to block any further publications. 3 hours later, Paul Prenter's name was crossed out of all lists, all passes, all wills. Freddie built a new wall around himself, but this time not to hide from the world, but to keep the rats out. However, standing there by the phone, Freddie felt something else. Loneliness. Now real, total, cosmic loneliness. The man who had been his shadow for 10 years had vanished, and in this void, Freddie suddenly realized that he had only one thing left that Prenter couldn't sell because it had no price: his dignity. He walked to the fireplace, where logs were already stacked, struck a match, and brought the fire to that very Sun newspaper. He watched his face on the front page turn black, curl up, and turn to ash. It was a ritual of purification. He wasn't burning paper. He was burning his dependence on a man who turned out to be cheaper than a used car. But the fire in the fireplace couldn't warm the cold that settled in his heart, because he knew the article was already out. The world had already read it. And now he had to leave the house and meet the gazes of millions of people who knew his darkest secret, and do it with his head held high, as befits a king, even if that king is naked. The fire in the Garden Lodge fireplace devoured the last pages of that ill-fated newspaper, turning Freddie's face and the dirty headlines into gray, weightless ash. But if you think the problem burned along with the paper, you are deeply mistaken, because the real cleaning was just beginning. The minute the last spark went out in the fireplace, Freddie Mercury ceased to be a victim of newspaper bullying and turned into a cold-blooded liquidator of his own past. You expect to see a broken man locking himself in the bedroom and sobbing into a pillow. Throw that image out of your head. Standing in the room was not a weeping singer, but a furious monarch who had discovered a rat in the throne room. He began to move through the house with frightening mechanical efficiency, opening desk drawers, shaking out the contents of boxes, ripping photos off the walls. What was he looking for? He was looking for any traces of Paul Prenter's presence, any proof that this man existed in his life at all. Joint photos from parties where they laughed, hugging, into the fire. Notes with apologies or confessions of love, into the fire. Gifts, trinkets, souvenirs from trips. Everything flew into the mouth of the fireplace, and with every burned object, the air in the room became cleaner, as if Freddie was performing an exorcism, expelling a demon he himself had invited. But in this furious destruction of evidence lay one detail that flips the meaning of what was happening and makes you feel a chill on your skin. Freddie was destroying the memory of Prenter, not because he hated him, but because he still loved the illusion Paul had created. Killing what you are indifferent to is easy, but cutting out of your heart what was a part of it for 10 years is amputation without anesthesia. You look at this and think, well there, he got revenge. He erased the traitor. Now Prenter will disappear. But here, the Santa Barbara effect hits hard. Prenter didn't disappear. While Freddie was burning bridges in London, Paul Prenter sat somewhere in a hotel room, counting his £32,000 and likely feeling like a lottery winner. However, let's apply our intellectual orgasm optics and look at this sum more closely. £32,000 sterling. In 1987, that was decent money, but it wasn't an amount that ensures a comfortable old age. It was the price of a used sports car. It was the price of a couple of good parties. Do you understand the full horror of this arithmetic? Prenter sold a legend's soul, sold 10 years of intimacy, sold a man's right to the secret of death, not for millions, but for pennies. He sold cheap. He sold a diamond for the price of broken glass. And the scariest part is that he realized this too late. As soon as the euphoria from the headlines passed, reality hit Paul Prenter with the force of a freight train. Do you think he became a celebrity after this article? That publishers lined up for his memoirs? Everything happened exactly the opposite. The music industry, even that dirty part of it that fed on gossip, turned away from him with disgust. No one wants to deal with a rat. Doors closed. The phone went silent. The money received from Rupert Murdoch began to melt at a catastrophic speed. Expensive hotels, booze, attempts to maintain the lifestyle Freddie had accustomed him to. All this burned his fee faster than the fire in the Garden Lodge. Fireplace burned the photos. And here we come to the climax, to that very dagger we planted in the first act, and which must now pierce your heart with its cruel irony. Remember the gold Cartier watch? That luxurious Christmas gift from Freddie, the symbol of their unbreakable bond, ticking on Prenter's wrist at the moment of betrayal? Now, when the money ran out, when friends scattered, and Paul's own health began to rapidly deteriorate under the onslaught of the same disease that was killing Freddie, this watch remained the trader's only asset. Imagine this scene. Paul Prenter, the former Grey Cardinal of Queen, the man who decided who was allowed to speak to Mercury, stands in a cheap pawn shop. He looks bad. He has lost weight. His skin has acquired that earthy hue that cannot be confused with anything else. He takes the watch off his hand, the very watch that counted the minutes of his power, the minutes of his closeness to the king. He puts it on the worn counter. The appraiser looks at the engraving on the back cover. Perhaps something personal, something warm, from Freddie was written there, and names a price. The price of scrap, the price of gold, by weight. Do you feel this blow of karma? Prenter sold Freddie to buy himself a life, but in the end, he was forced to sell the last symbol of Freddie's love, to buy himself death, to pay for medicine and painkillers for his final days. The Cartier watch, given with love, became a means of survival for the man who trampled on that love. It was the final act of the tragedy. Freddie's gold was saving the life of his killer, even when Freddie himself had already erased him from memory. But Freddie in his mansion didn't know about this pawn shop. He finished the cleaning. The room was empty. The photos burned. The locks changed. Lawyers were already preparing lawsuits. He sat in the armchair, and for the first time in a long while, felt not pain, but a strange, ringing emptiness. He was absolutely alone in his huge house. Prenter's betrayal did what years of therapy couldn't. It killed in Freddie the hope that he could be loved just for being himself. Now he knew the price of every person in his circle. £32,000, that's the market value of 10 years of friendship. This knowledge was bitter as poison, but it was necessary medicine. Freddie closed his eyes and realized that now that the masks were off and the rats had fled the ship, he had only one thing left: music and time, of which catastrophically little remained. Tick-tock. The Cartier watch in the pawn shop counted down time for one dying man, and the clock in Garden Lodge for another. Their fates diverged forever, but they had one finale, and it approached with the inexorability of doom. Do you think this is the end of the story? No, because the void left by Prenter had to be filled with something, and Freddie decided to fill it with work until his last breath, turning his agony into the greatest album in rock history. The music cuts off on the highest piercing note, the screen goes dark, and in this sudden, deafening silence that follows the burning of bridges, you are left alone with a simple but frightening fact. The story of Paul Prenter's betrayal did not end the moment Freddie Mercury hung up the phone. You probably think the villain got his 30 pieces of silver and rode off into the sunset to live happily ever after, sipping cocktails on a tropical island. This is the most common myth with which we comfort ourselves, believing that evil always goes unpunished. But reality prepared a finale for Paul that surpasses any script of ancient tragedy in its cruel irony. Let's trace the path of this cursed money. those very £32,000 for which Prenter sold the soul of his only friend. Remember the gold Cartier watch we talked about at the very beginning? That very dagger, the symbol of Freddie's love and generosity, ticking on the trader's wrist? Now imagine this mechanism counting down not time, but decay. The money from the sun evaporated faster than morning dew in the desert. Prenter, accustomed to a luxurious lifestyle at Mercury's expense, limousines, crystal champagne, and the best hotels, tried to maintain this level on his own, but discovered that without Freddie's gold card, he was nobody. The industry, even that dirty part of it that feeds on gossip, spat him out with disgust. No one wanted to hire a man who sold his client. He became an outcast, a leper, a man with a black mark on his forehead. And here the plot takes that very Santa Barbara turn that will send a chill down your spine. Karma hit Paul Prenter not with bankruptcy, but with the exact same weapon he tried to use against Freddie. While he was telling tabloids about Mercury's secret plague, about his fear of AIDS, Paul himself was already carrying this virus in his blood. Do you understand the monstrous cynicism of the situation? He was selling the secrets of a dying man while being a walking dead man himself. The money he got for the betrayal ultimately went not to entertainment, but to pay his own hospital bills, for painkillers, and for attempts to delay the inevitable. Paul Prenter died in Belfast in August 1991, just 3 months before Freddie's death. He died in poverty, forgotten by everyone, in a cheap ward, and there were no crowds of fans at his funeral, no flowers from stars, no obituaries in the global media. There was only silence. And now compare this to what happened in November of the same year when Freddie passed. The whole world mourned the king. His legacy shone brighter than the sun. His music played from every window, and his name became synonymous with greatness. Prenter wanted to steal Freddie's fame, but in the end, he stole from himself even the right to a dignified memory. He remained in history only as a dirty stain, a footnote in the biography of a genius, an example of how low a person can fall. But let's dig deeper to where it hurts the most. We are used to demonizing Prenter, calling him Judas, a monster, a predator. It's convenient. It allows us to see Freddie as a pure victim, an innocent lamb deceived by a wicked wolf. But I want you now, in the finale of this story, to ask yourself the most uncomfortable, cruelest question that destroys this black and white myth. Was Freddie blind? Look truth in the eye. Mercury was not a naive child. He was a brilliant, astute man who built an empire. He saw right through people, and yet he kept Prenter close to him for almost 10 years. Why? Maybe because he needed Prenter? Maybe Freddie, torn apart by inner demons, needed a person who would indulge his vices, who would organize parties, who would chase away boring, proper people like Brian May. What if Prenter wasn't a virus, but a symptom? A symptom of that total, cosmic loneliness Freddie felt while at the top of the world. He let a vampire into his house, knowing he drank blood, simply because he was afraid to sleep in the dark alone. He allowed Paul to build this wall of isolation, because deep down, he wanted to hide from responsibility, from the pressure of fame, from the need to be perfect. This thought eats at the soul. Prenter's betrayal was the inevitable finale of a relationship that was toxic on both sides. Freddie used Paul as a shield from reality, and Paul used Freddie as an ATM. And when the ATM closed, the shield turned into a sword. This doesn't excuse Prenter's baseness, but it makes Freddie's tragedy even deeper. He didn't just become the victim of a con man, he became the victim of his own need for love, even in such a distorted, corrupt, and dirty form. Now that you see the full picture, from the headline in The Sun to the lonely grave in Belfast, from the gold Cartier watch sold in a pawn shop to the eternal flame of Mercury's glory, I place before you the scales of history. On one pan is Paul Prenter, absolute evil, a man who violated the main law of friendship. On the other is Freddie Mercury, great and terrible, who brought this end closer by his choice of entourage? Who is to blame for this Judas getting so close to the king's heart and striking at the most vulnerable moment? Is it the cold calculation of the predator-printer who took advantage of a sick man's weakness? Or is it the tragic fault of Freddie himself, who was so blinded by loneliness and the glare of fake adoration that he himself handed the killer the knife and turned his back to him? Who is the real villain here? The predator who acted according to his nature, or the blind man who refused to see the truth until it was printed in the newspaper? This isn't just a question about the past. It's a test of your understanding of human nature. Go down to the comments right now. I don't want to see banal phrases about how you love Queen. I want to see your verdict in this moral court. Predator or blind man? Write one word and explain why. Let this dispute be the final chord in the requiem for a friendship that cost one his life and the other his honor. I will wait for your opinion, because the truth, as always, is somewhere in the middle, and we can only find it together.